Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really going to get into a complex geopolitical situation, but we're looking at it through a lens you might not often hear about.
That's right. We're unpacking the whole U.S., Israel, and Iran confrontation, but specifically, from a Russian viewpoint.
Exactly. And our mission here is basically to give you the key takeaways. We've gone through the source material. There's this one analysis, challenging Western hegemony, a Russian perspective on the U.S.-Israeli confrontation with Iran, and pulled out what you really need to know.
Yeah, the goal isn't just to list facts, but to help you grasp the nuances, like why Moscow sees things this way and why that viewpoint actually matters on the world stage.
Absolutely. And it's super important to say this up front. We're here to understand and explain the arguments in this specific source.
Right. We're not taking sides or saying this is right or this is wrong. It's about exploring Moscow's interpretation, their logic, and, the implications they see. It just gives you a richer picture.
Okay, so let's dive in. Russia's overall take on Western actions. Where do they start? What's the core idea?
Well, right from the start, Moscow frames the aggressive stance from the U.S. and Israel towards Iran as, well, their words are yet another example of the West's longstanding geopolitical strategy
Apogee
of dominance, destabilization, and regime manipulation. So it's basically Russia saying, look, this isn't new. This fits a pattern we've seen before.
Okay, so that's the frame. And how do they see Iran itself within that picture? Not as the problem, then.
No, not really. The source suggests Russia views Iran less as a threat and more as a regional power asserting its sovereignty.
Asserting sovereignty against what specifically?
Against what they describe as relentless pressure from Western alliances. So right away, Iran is positioned as resisting, not, initiating aggression.
So if that's the big picture, how does Moscow talk about the specific things we've seen recently? The airstrikes, the sabotage, the sanctions, are these just random events?
Definitely not random from their perspective. They see these recent actions as illegal, unprovoked, and dangerous escalations. The source is pretty explicit on this.
Yeah. And dangerous because?
What's the impact they see?
Because they believe these actions fundamentally undermine global security. And more than that, they further fragment the international order. It's like pouring fuel on the fire, basically.
Okay, so that's at the stage. Then they move on to this whole non-proliferation argument, right? The idea that the West is trying to stop Iran getting nuclear weapons.
Right. And this is where Moscow uses some pretty strong language. They call the Western narrative here deeply hypocritical and politically motivated.
Hypocritical.
Yeah.
How so? What's the evidence they point to?
It really boils down to what they call selective enforcement. They draw a sharp contrast
Between Iran
and Israel. Look, Iran signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, right?
Right.
And it allows IAEA inspectors in.
Okay.
Israel, on the other hand, well, it's widely believed to have nuclear weapons. It hasn't signed the NPT, and it doesn't allow those kinds of inspections. And Russia's point is that Israel doesn't face the same pressure.
Exactly. According to this source, Israel faces no international pressure or scrutiny on this issue. And for Moscow, that disparity just completely blows up the idea that the West is genuinely concerned only about proliferation itself.
And then there's the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the U.S. pulling out in 2018. How does that fit into Russia's argument?
Oh, that's huge for them. They see the U.S. withdrawal as a grave diplomatic violation. I mean, really undermining the deal.
And they connect that directly to Iran reducing its own compliance later on.
Absolutely. They basically say, look, the U.S. broke the deal first. That's what triggered Iran stepping back. So from Moscow's angle, the West kind of shot itself in the foot if non-proliferation was the real goal.
So tying it all together, what's the conclusion Moscow draws from this? If it's not about stopping nukes, what is it about?
Well, according to this analysis, the conclusion is pretty stark. It's not about stopping nuclear weapons. It's about maintaining monopoly on strategic power and basically punishing independent nations that refuse to submit to Washington's dictates. It's geopolitics, plain and simple, in their view, not arms control.
Right, that certainly fits the broader frame they establish. So, okay, moving beyond just reacting to the West, what about Russia's own approach? They have a strong partnership with Iran. How does that play into things?
Yeah, that partnership is key. Moscow sees Iran as, well, a really crucial partner in building what they call a multipolar world order.
Multipolar meaning opposed to a world dominated by one power like the U.S.
Exactly. They see Iran alongside others like China, Syria, even within groups like BRICS, as standing against that Western model, the unipolarity, the, regime change interventions.
So Iran is a strategic role for Russia in the Middle East.
A very significant one. The source portrays Iran as a vital counterweight
Counterweight to whom?
to the NATO-aligned Gulf monarchies and all the U.S. military bases encircling the region. They point out that Iran has, resisted Western military interventions, defended itself, and supported groups that Moscow sees as opposing Western neo-imperialism. The source mentions Hezbollah, Ansarullah in Yemen, the Houthis, and certain Iraqi militias. These are framed as resistance actors.
Okay, so if Iran is seen as this resisting counterweight, how does that shape Russia's view of Iran's own military programs? The missiles, the nuclear program.
Well, it flips the script again. From this perspective, those programs are seen as primarily defensive in nature.
Defensive, even the nuclear aspects.
Yeah, because they argue Iran is, and I quote, surrounded by hostile neighbors and under constant threat from Israel and the U.S. So building up its defenses, even advanced ones, is framed as a legitimate national security policy, almost a necessity, not an aggression.
It makes sense within that logic. Which leads us to the question. If Russia doesn't buy the non-proliferation argument, what do they think are the actual reasons behind U.S. and Israeli actions? The source talks about a broader imperial project, right?
It does, and it highlights two main drivers, two real motives, according to Moscow.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is all about energy, specifically securing control of energy corridors.
How does Iran fit into that?
Well, Iran's location is incredibly strategic, right at the heart of Eurasian energy transit routes. Russia suggests Washington wants to exclude Iran from these networks.
Exclude them. Why? To keep control.
Pretty much, while also maintaining dominance over OPEC through Gulf allies. The thinking, according to the source, is that if you destabilize Iran, you ensure continued reliance on Western-controlled trade and energy routes. It's about keeping that leverage.
Okay, energy control. That's motive one. What's the second big one?
The second one is about integration, or rather blocking integration, specifically blocking Iran's integration into Eurasia.
Integration like?
Yeah.
Joining groups, building ties.
Exactly. Things like Iran potentially joining BRICS, or strengthening its ties with Russia, China, India. Moscow believes the West sees this as a major threat.
A threat to what?
A threat to Western hegemony. The source talks about a fear in the West of the emergence of a Eurasian economic bloc.
An economic bloc that could challenge the current system.
Precisely. One that bypasses the U.S. dollar and maybe institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And so things like sanctions and sabotage, from this viewpoint, are tools used to stop Iran becoming a key hub in projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative or the North-South Transport Corridor.
So trying to keep Iran isolated economically and politically to prevent a rival bloc emerging?
That seems to be the core of the argument, yeah. It's about preventing that shift in global economic power.
Okay, so given this whole analysis, the view of Western hypocrisy, Iran is a resistor, these underlying motives, Russia must have some pretty direct warnings for the West, right? About continuing down this path with Iran.
Oh, absolutely. The source outlines several clear dangers that Moscow is highlighting.
Such as?
Well, first, legally. They stress these actions against Iran are often illegal under international law because they lack UN Security Council approval. That's a fundamental point for them.
Okay, legality. What else?
Second, stability. They're destabilizing to the region. Moscow warns explicitly about the risk of a wider war, something that could easily spill over into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, across the Middle East.
A regional conflict. That's a serious warning. Any other points?
Yes. Third, they argue it's actually counterproductive from a Western security perspective.
Counterproductive how?
Because the pressure, the attacks, they just encourage Iran to develop underground and asymmetric military capabilities, basically pushing Iran to get tougher and harder to deal with. And there's this stark warning that the West might be sleepwalking into another Iraq or Libya-style disaster. But, and this is crucial, against a far more prepared and militarized state this time. Iran isn't Iraq in 2003.
Right. That's a very chilling comparison. So, faced with these dangers, what's the alternative Russia proposes? They can't just be warning, surely.
No, they advocate for a specific path forward. They call for a multipolar dialogue.
And what does that actually look like in practice?
It involves a few key things. First, the restoration of the JCPOA through multilateral diplomacy. get back to the nuclear deal, but involving everyone.
Okay, bring back the deal. What else?
They also push for an inclusive regional security architecture, basically a security setup for the Middle East that isn't dominated by the U.S., and, really importantly,
Yes.
the lifting of unilateral sanctions, not just on Iran, but they mention others like Syria and Venezuela too. Get rid of those coercive economic measures.
So a shift towards diplomacy, regional inclusion, and ending sanctions. And central to this seems to be how Iran itself is treated.
Absolutely central. Russia insists on treating Tehran as a legitimate regional actor, not as a rogue state.
And they draw a parallel, don't they?
A very direct one. The source quotes their position. Just as Russia resists NATO's encroachment on its borders, Iran has the right to resist encirclement by American and Israeli forces. It's about applying the same principles of sovereignty and security concerns universally.
Okay, so bringing this all together for you listening.
Yeah.
What's the ultimate takeaway from this Russian perspective?
I think the core message from Moscow, as presented in this source, is that this whole Iran confrontation isn't really just about Iran's policy.
It's bigger than that.
Much bigger. It's a symbolic and strategic battle over the future of global power distribution. It's about who gets to set the rules, essentially.
And in that battle, how are the sides positioned, according to Moscow?
Well, the source suggests that as the West clings to its fading dominance through militarism and coercion, nations like Iran and implicitly Russia see themselves as united.
United in doing what?
United in defending sovereignty, multipolarity, and international law. It's framed as a defense against an old order trying to maintain control.
Which leaves us with a really striking final thought from this analysis. It basically says that, in Moscow's eyes,
Iran is not the aggressor, it is the resistor.
and that resistance isn't just okay, it's necessary.
Exactly. Resistance to hegemony is not just justified, it is necessary for a fairer global future. So this deep dive hopefully gives you a very different but coherent framework for thinking about these events, a crucial perspective to have in your toolkit.
Subscribe for more.